Have you ever wondered why the Jewish people are called God's chosen people? From Abraham to the present day, this idea spans generations and challenges interpretations. But ultimately, what does it mean to be chosen? Is it a privilege? A responsibility? Or something that involves all of us? Let's explore this biblical mystery and discover the role of the Jewish people in God's and humanity's history. It all begins with Abraham, a figure who emerges unexpectedly in the biblical narrative. He is an ordinary man who suddenly receives an extraordinary promise: all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Genesis 12 verse 3. God calls Abraham, a nomadic shepherd, and makes him the starting point of a new nation, promising him land, descendants, and blessings. But what does this call really mean? For Abraham, it wasn't just an opportunity, it was the beginning of a greater purpose that he didn't fully comprehend. Abraham had to abandon his home, his culture, and even the security of a predictable life. In return, he received the chance to pioneer something grand. The promise to Abraham wasn't just about a specific group but had a universal reach. It's interesting to note how God mentions all the families of the earth in his promise. This small phrase already suggests that the blessing granted to Abraham and his descendants extends to other peoples. His call is the starting point for a vision of humanity that goes beyond borders, for God planned to reach everyone through this people. Thus, the choice of Abraham and his lineage wasn't for the exclusion of others but for service and example. With this covenant, Abraham took on an immense responsibility to represent God and live according to his promises. And he wasn't perfect, his journey had moments of doubt and weakness, but even so, he maintained faith and obedience. This reveals that the divine call wasn't based on human perfection but on the willingness to follow, even amid uncertainty. Abraham thus becomes a model of faith and obedience that still echoes today. Most impressively, Abraham didn't even see the fulfillment of the entire promise during his lifetime. He died with the confidence that his descendants would inherit what was promised to him, showing a faith that transcended the moment. This faith in something greater than himself influenced generations. Throughout the Bible, we see figures who look to Abraham as a symbol of perseverance and trust in divine promises, regardless of circumstances. Thus, Abraham's call marks the beginning of a journey that spreads throughout history and still inspires, even after thousands of years. The initial promise, then, is much more than a privilege. It's a call that touches humanity. And that's where the true mystery of being the chosen people begins, a promise that never stops being fulfilled. With the arrival of Moses, the history of the Jewish people takes a significant leap. After centuries of slavery in Egypt, they receive an unexpected and powerful liberation, led by a man who initially hesitated to accept his mission. Moses leads the people to Mount Sinai, where an event occurs that would forever mark Israel's identity, the giving of the law. By receiving the 10 Commandments and other instructions directly from God, the people enter a new phase of commitment, where every aspect of life, moral, social, and spiritual, is influenced by this sacred covenant. What is fascinating about this covenant at Sinai is the mutual commitment it establishes. God offers protection, guidance, and a land where the people could prosper. In return, Israel was to follow his laws and maintain faithfulness. It wasn't an imposition but an invitation to a life of holiness and purpose. The law, therefore, served as a guide for behavior in the people's relationship with God and with each other, reflecting an ideal society where everyone's well-being was guaranteed by obedience to the commandments. The covenant at Sinai also introduces the concept of collective responsibility. If one member of the people strayed from the divine instructions, it could impact the entire community. The idea of unity was so strong that the actions of an individual were seen as part of the whole, and each one's obedience or disobedience affected the nation. This mutual responsibility solidified the concept of a chosen people, where everyone needed to keep the covenant active and alive in their daily lives. Moreover, the covenant at Sinai marked a distinction between Israel and other peoples. Obedience to the law made the Jewish people notably different, and this uniqueness was both a protection and a testimony. Other nations would see in Israel an example of righteousness and prosperity based on spiritual values. However, this difference also generated tensions, especially when the people failed to follow the commandments and faced consequences like invasions and exiles, which the prophets explained as divine corrections. Finally, the covenant at Sinai wasn't an end in itself but a means of shaping a people who would influence generations. Even today, principles of the Ten Commandments still resonate as universal values, showing the reach of this covenant. The law given to Moses created the foundations for Israel's identity and the role they would play in God's plan. Thus, the journey of the Jewish people became more complex and challenging but also deeper, preparing the ground for the next chapters of their sacred history. Over the centuries, the Jewish people faced challenges that tested their faith and commitment to the covenant. It was in this context that the prophets emerged, enigmatic and powerful figures who had a clear mission: to remind Israel of its call as the chosen people and the consequences of straying from the law. Each prophet carried a message of warning, hope, and repentance, always aiming to restore the people's connection with God. They were God's voice in times of crisis when the nation deviated, forgetting the covenant made at Sinai. The prophets played an essential role because they kept alive the sense of identity and collective responsibility. For them, being the chosen people wasn't an unquestionable status but a responsibility that required faithfulness and justice. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Amos denounced social injustice, idolatry, and religious hypocrisy, calling the people to repent and return to the right path. According to the prophets, Israel's identity should reflect God's justice and mercy, a task that required sacrifices and obedience. The central point of the prophetic message was that Israel's election didn't mean immunity to suffering or endless privileges. On the contrary, when the people strayed, correction was inevitable. In times of disobedience, the prophets reminded them that God would allow exile, famine, and even defeat in battle so that the people would understand the value of the covenant and repentance. They saw divine discipline as an act of love, a way to lead Israel back to its original purpose. Besides warnings, the prophets were also bearers of hope. They foresaw restoration and redemption, promising that God wouldn't abandon His people even in the worst moments. For them, the covenant was eternal, and a faithful remnant would always exist to keep the promise alive. This hope sustained Israel in times of exile and dispersion, reminding the people that their identity was deeply linked to the divine purpose and not to temporary setbacks. Through the prophets, Israel received a vision of its role in the world, a vision that transcends time and borders. They reminded the people that the true identity of the chosen ones lies in honoring the covenant with God and being a living example of His justice and mercy. This was the essence of being the chosen people, not a title, but a mission. The arrival of Jesus Christ brought a new perspective to the idea of the chosen people. From the beginning of His life and ministry, Jesus presented a message that expanded the notion of who could approach God and be part of His people. Jesus spoke with Jews and Gentiles, people of different backgrounds and classes, showing that God's grace knew no boundaries. He affirmed that all were welcome in the kingdom of heaven, and with that, He changed the concept of divine choice, not limited to a lineage but open to all who would follow him. For Jesus, God's covenant with humanity wasn't limited to external rules but was something that should transform the heart. When he summarized the law in 2 commandments, to love God above all things and to love one's neighbor as oneself, he reaffirmed the essence of God's covenant with Israel but gave it a new reach. Through Jesus, God's message crossed Israel's borders and offered the world the opportunity to be part of God's family, making all who accepted his message part of the chosen. This new covenant, often called the New Testament, also redefined Israel's role. Jesus was Jewish and honored his people's tradition, but his coming represented the conclusion of one era and the beginning of another. He saw himself as the fulfillment of the promises made to Abraham and David, and by giving his life, he opened a way for Jews and Gentiles to reconcile with God. In his words, all who did the will of God could be part of his family, Matthew 12 verse 50. Thus, the concept of divine election became more inclusive, emphasizing faith and obedience, not just descent. Jesus also challenged his followers to live according to the new covenant, no longer marked by strict adherence to rituals but by an inner transformation. He brought a message of redemption not only to those who followed the law of Moses but to all who were willing to follow him. This resonated especially among the early Christians, who believed that Jesus' mission was to fulfill the law and the prophets and open the doors to a relationship with God based on faith. With this new covenant, the vision of the chosen people expanded, and many came to understand that the divine promise now included people from all nations. This change didn't nullify Israel's role but placed it in a new perspective within the divine plan. Jesus' message, therefore, wasn't a rejection of Israel but an invitation for all to share in the blessing promised since Abraham, transforming the covenant into a global mission. The history of the Jewish people is marked by moments of dispersion, persecution, and exile, which brought great challenges to maintaining their faith and identity. When Israel and Judah were invaded and many were taken captive, first to Assyria and then to Babylon, the continuity of Jewish identity seemed threatened. Far from their land, the temple, and the rituals that united them as a nation, the Jewish people had to develop new ways to practice their faith and preserve their values. Survival during exile became an act of spiritual resistance. The diaspora, or dispersion, wasn't just a period of separation but a crucial moment for forming a more solid identity. The Jews established synagogues as centers of gathering and prayer, and the Torah took on an even more central role in religious and cultural life. By adapting, the Jewish people demonstrated unique resilience, as they maintained their faith, customs, and laws even in foreign lands. This period of exile ended up strengthening Jewish identity, transforming it into something that could survive even without the physical presence of a temple or nation. If you're enjoying this journey through the history and meaning of the Jewish people, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications so you don't miss any details. This support helps us continue exploring deep themes and sharing content that inspires and brings understanding. This perseverance in keeping identity and faith alive became a hallmark of Jewish culture. Even after returning from exile and rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, the experience of the diaspora left an indelible mark. Over the centuries, the Jews were exiled multiple times and scattered around the world, but in each community, in each new country, the essence of their faith remained present. This ability to adapt without losing essence is one of the great mysteries of the Jewish people. Survival through centuries of dispersion shows that Jewish identity isn't limited to a specific territory but rooted in a relationship with God that transcends borders. This is part of the mystery of the chosen people, a nation that remains united not by external circumstances but by a spiritual covenant that continuously renews itself, regardless of where they are. The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, especially after centuries of diaspora, is an event many see as confirmation of ancient divine promises. The creation of the modern state of Israel in 1948 marked a new phase, rekindling questions about the meaning of election and Israel's role in God's plans. For some, the return represents a new phase in fulfilling the promises made to Abraham and David, where Israel continues to be a fundamental piece in humanity's spiritual history. This presence of Israel, however, goes beyond the simple occupation of land. It carries a spiritual purpose and symbolism that transcends territory. Israel as a nation occupies a central space in biblical prophecies and the vision of a divine plan that includes reconciliation and redemption of all creation. Many scholars and religious leaders see this return to the land as preparation for future events that will impact not only the Jews but the entire world. This understanding doesn't negate the difficulties and conflicts Israel faces, both internally and with neighboring nations. However, the challenges are part of the trajectory of a people who, according to the scriptures, carry a special mission. The rebirth of Israel as a nation and the preservation of its identity over millennia of dispersion are considered by many as modern miracles that reinforce the idea of an ongoing call. In the current context, Israel's role also prompts reflections on the meaning of divine choice in a globalized world. Israel today not only preserves a sacred history but also serves as an example of resilience, faith, and commitment to tradition. And the question remains, what does it mean to be chosen in the present time? Is it a call to maintain hope and faith even in a world of uncertainties? The mystery continues to intrigue and inspire generations around the world. One of the biggest debates involving the concept of the chosen people is whether this implies exclusive privilege or a mission of service to humanity. Since ancient times, the idea that God chose Israel could suggest a special position, but the biblical texts themselves often address the opposite. In various passages, Israel is called not to isolate itself but to be a light to the nations, Isaiah 49 verse 6, representing an example of justice and compassion to the world. Throughout history, the exclusivity of Israel's divine choice has been interpreted in various ways. Some see this election as a responsibility involving both blessings and sacrifices. The nation of Israel, according to tradition, is called to keep the covenant with God and live righteously, being a model of spiritual life. In other words, being the chosen people doesn't mean superiority but a commitment to a greater purpose that includes serving and blessing other nations rather than just seeking benefits for themselves. This idea of service also highlights what it means to be an example. If Israel failed in its mission, the consequences were clear, as described in the prophetic books. The chosen people were continually reminded that the covenant wasn't a guarantee of prosperity but a call to live according to God's values. Exclusivity, then, was more linked to responsibility than privilege. In modern times, this debate remains relevant. Being chosen is a responsibility that many Jews see as an invitation to service and solidarity with humanity, not a position of isolation. And this call to service is also an invitation to all who seek a spiritual life, showing that true divine choice lies in living according to teachings of justice and love for one's neighbor. Exclusivity, then, is reconfigured as a shared mission, an invitation to all who wish to serve. The concept of the chosen people remains in constant evolution, challenging each one to reflect on what it really means to be chosen today and how this can impact the lives of those around them. Today, the idea of a chosen people prompts reflections that go beyond religious traditions. In a globalized and interconnected world, the concept starts to dialogue with universal issues like identity, solidarity, and commitment to others. For many, being chosen ceases to be seen as an exclusive privilege and begins to be understood as a collective responsibility, something that transcends cultural and religious boundaries. This modern perspective interprets Israel's election as an example of faith and resilience for all peoples. Instead of a status that differentiates, the call of the Jewish people becomes a message that the connection with the divine is within reach of anyone who seeks to live with purpose and compassion. The modern world sees, in the example of the Jewish people, a living demonstration of perseverance and commitment to spiritual values, even in the face of numerous adversities. This universal message also reflects a common desire for peace, justice, and love for one's neighbor. The journey of the Jewish people, with its ups and downs, inspires individuals of all backgrounds to reflect on their own identities and responsibilities. After all, the notion of chosen ones can be understood as a universal invitation to a life of purpose, where each one has a unique and irreplaceable role in building a more just and supportive world. Thus, the mystery of the chosen people continues to inspire and challenge everyone, regardless of their faith or origin, to live in harmony with values that promote peace and justice. So, what does it mean to be chosen? By exploring this story, we've seen how this idea evolved, gained new contours, and touched many lives. But in the end, the great lesson here might be that the true value of a divine choice lies in how it calls us to live with purpose and an open heart. It's not about status or exclusivity, it's about how we can use this call to impact the world around us. The history of the Jewish people reminds us that even with challenges, it's possible to remain faithful to something greater. And you? Have you thought about how you can make a difference in your life and in others' lives with small acts of faith, justice, and kindness? Sometimes, our mission is closer than we imagine, in the things we do day by day. Perhaps we all have a special role to fulfill. If this reflection brought new ideas to you, take the opportunity to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. This helps bring this type of content to more people. And leave your comment. What does being chosen mean to you? Let's exchange ideas and learn together.